Hi everyone, this is the third video in a series of videos that I've been doing on tuning FPV quads. And today we're going to be looking at getting your rates set up so that the quad feels right for you in the air. I'm going to be taking you through step by step all of the tools that Betaflight gives you to get your rates set up just perfectly for how you like to fly. So let's get right into it. So before we look at rates, let's recap the tuning process we've done so far. We started by checking our mechanicals and making sure our quad was in a fit state to be tuned. We then flew it on stock Betaflight filters and PIDs, and we took some logs, some gyro scaled logs, and we looked at those logs to set the filters. We then found our maximum comfortable D-gain using the master slider. And then we used the PD balance and PD gain sliders to find the right PD balance to give us a critically damped step response. And finally, we tuned feed forward for set point tracking, so the quad was following set point really closely. Now, don't worry if you aren't familiar with all of these steps. I've done two previous videos, a first video where I've covered setting up the filters, and a second video where I've covered setting up the PIDs. So if you've not seen those videos and you've not followed along with those steps, go back and watch those videos before you watch this video, because you don't really want to be tuning your rates before you've got your PIDs dialed in, because it's like trying to drive a car with a loose steering rack. It's never going to feel quite right until you get that set point tracking really good. If, however, you've covered all of these steps, it's time to reset your rates, because you may find, like I did, that your rates feel very different when your PIDs have been tuned than how they felt before. So up until now, this tuning approach has been entirely scientific. We have been trying to minimize the phase delay of the filters and also minimize the amount of high frequency noise entering the PID loop. We've been trying to maximize our D-gain, and we've been trying to achieve a critically damped step response from the PID controller. And then we've been increasing feed forward so that our quad tracks set point as closely as possible. And there's no subjectivity about this. It's a very objective, very scientific approach to tuning. This is a very no-holds-barred, min-max approach to tuning to try and get the absolute best possible response out of the quad. So now we have a quad that can follow a set point exceptionally well, but we still have to determine what that set point should be. How do our finger movements on the controller translate into what we ask the quad to do? And this is going to be a very subjective experience for every pilot. But fortunately, we have a lot of tools that we can use to get the feel that we want. And that's going to be what we cover in this video. In my opinion, we have to start with throttle, because throttle is all too often neglected in tuning. Big, powerful motors like we fit on our 5-inch quads give great responsiveness and stability in the air, but they have to be tempered to give the best possible flight feel. I really can't overstate how important this is. Betaflight gives us 3 important tools to do this. The first is a throttle limit. This allows us to scale our throttle to the range we actually use when we're flying. Then we have the throttle midpoint. Now this is the point around which you need the maximum possible resolution, and typically that will be the point where you spend most of your time. And finally we have throttle Expo, and more Expo gives more throttle resolution around the midpoint that we found in the second step, at the expense of resolution at the edges. So let's go through each of these tools step by step. So first, let's tune throttle limit. So the way that I do this is just go and fly lots of freestyle with logging enabled. Then look at the logs of frequency versus throttle. Now this is a log for my 7-inch quad, and you can see how I never really went above about 70% throttle in this whole freestyle flight. Now, throttle resolution is the change in thrust per millimeter of throttle stick movement. And I measured it, and on my controller, 0 to 100% throttle is 35 millimeters of stick movement. But if I never go over 70% throttle when I'm flying, I am only ever using 24.5 millimeters of that 35 millimeters of stick movement. Now I can use a throttle limit to make full throttle on my sticks 70% throttle, and then I can use my full stick movement, all 35 millimeters, when I'm flying. And this will increase my effective throttle resolution by 43%, which is a huge amount. And that increase in throttle resolution will just affect my sticks. It won't affect the PID controller. The PID controller will still be able to use full throttle when it feels it needs to correct for a particularly sharp move, for example. That throttle resolution is going to really be what governs the amount of throttle feel, particularly at the low end, that you experience as a pilot. And so it's really important to make sure that you are using the full range of the sticks whenever you're flying, and you can do that with a throttle limit. So how do we set a throttle limit in Betaflight? Well, we go into the rate profile settings tab in the PID tuning section. We set the throttle limit to scale. That will scale your stick movement rather than just clipping it or anything like that. And we set the throttle level that we want at our full stick position, our full throttle stick position. So in this case, I've set it to 70 because I want full throttle on my sticks to be 70% throttle in Betaflight. And that's all you have to do. Now let's talk about throttle midpoint and Expo. Now with pitch, roll and yaw, we purposefully sacrifice resolution at the edges for more resolution around the center stick position. And we can and should do the same for throttle to get more throttle resolution where we spend most of our time. And this is what it looks like on a throttle curve. You can see here that we've got more resolution in this area than we have in this area and this area. Now you don't need much throttle resolution at all around full throttle for freestyle, because typically it's just a full throttle punch that you're doing into a dynamic move. You're not trying to modulate that really carefully. We tend to need more resolution around our kind of mid-ish throttle position where we spend most of our time when we're flying around. Now, how can we choose our midpoint value? The midpoint value should be around the area where you spend most of your time. So if we look at this black box log here and we come down to this blue line here, this is showing us our throttle that we use throughout the flight. And as I look along here, I can see that I'm spending most of my time around this sort of throttle level, with the occasional spike up, but most of my time is spent around this throttle level. And so if I scrub through the log to an area where I'm using that amount of throttle, shown by this red line, and I come up and look at the set point throttle icon in the legend, and this is using the UAV Tech Trace Template 0, I can see that I'm always around between 20 and 30% throttle most of the time. So for me and this quad, a natural midpoint is about 25% throttle. And that will give me the most resolution between 20 and 30% throttle. And it will give up a bit of resolution at, full throttle and zero throttle, which is fine because I don't spend much time at full throttle and I don't spend much time at zero throttle either. Now, Throttle Expo is how much resolution you're trading off. So the more Throttle Expo you apply, the more throttle resolution you'll get around your midpoint, and the less throttle resolution you'll get at full stick. Now, this Expo is really very subjective. It's going to be up to you. I would say start with 0.5 and increase the Expo if you want more center stick resolution, more throttle resolution around your midpoint, and decrease the Expo if you feel like you don't have enough throttle resolution at full throttle or zero throttle. And just keep moving that value around until it's right for you. And you'll see what the throttle curve looks like in this throttle curve preview, which will hopefully help you see when you change this mid value and Expo value, how that affects the curve. I wanted to give a warning here about marketing and hype in FPV. A lot of motors and props are advertised as having great low-end throttle resolution or feel and great top-end power. Please don't pick your motor and prop combination based on throttle feel. I have a video on choosing motors. I'll put a link to that in the video description below for best performance for a particular quad. And I also have a video on choosing props. I'll put a link down in the video description below for that, for certain types of flying. You are going to achieve a much better overall result if you choose your motor and prop scientifically for the best performance for what you want to do, and then tune feel using throttle limit and Expo. So you might pick a really big beefy motor and then apply a throttle limit so that you get all the benefit of the torque of that motor without just having too much power that you don't know what to do with. And you might use throttle Expo to take that big powerful motor, which you want all the power at full throttle because you love those really dynamic fast moves, and use the throttle Expo to give you that throttle resolution that you need, which you might otherwise lack if you're using a really big motor and an aggressive prop. Now let's move on to talk about rates. Rates are inherently very personal, so don't be afraid to experiment to find what feels best for you, and don't be surprised if the rates that you like are very different from the rates that someone else likes, because it will really come down to your personal preference and how you fly. I personally fly stock Betaflight rates, I guess because I am just boring like that. I like the actual rates, which is a type of rates in Betaflight, because they're really easy to use. So the rest of this video is going to be using actual rates in Betaflight. You can select the actual rates in this rates type box up here. Whatever type of rates you use, the graph, the rates preview graph, will show you what is happening. And that's going to be a really important tool to help you understand how changing the different parameters affects your rates. Now let's take a look at the tools that we have to get our rates just right. To start with, let's look at max rate. Now this is the rate of rotation that you command at full stick deflection. So when you have your stick hard against the stops, this is how fast your quad is going to be going. Typical values for max rate are around 500 to 600 degrees a second for racing. Some racers have a little less, maybe down as low as 400. If you're flying freestyle, typical rates are anywhere from about 600 to 1200 degrees a second. Now, in general, I would suggest erring on the lower side. If you're always hitting full stick and it's just not enough, then yes, you can increase your rates a little so you have a little bit more speed at full stick. If you never get to full stick, decrease your rates a bit, because you want to be using the full stick travel when you're flying so that you get the maximum possible resolution. Now, to set your max rate, you use these boxes here, and I would suggest that you keep your max rates on all the axes pretty much the same. I don't see a strong argument for having a different max rate for roll, pitch, and yaw. I generally keep them all the same. But of course, this is going to be completely up to you as a pilot. You can see in the rates preview bar what changing the max rate does. It just increases the point at full stick, and there's still this nice smooth curve between them, but it doesn't affect the sensitivity at center stick. So let's talk a little more about center stick sensitivity. This determines the resolution that you have at center stick. If you're struggling to fly smooth lines, try decreasing your sensitivity, because that will mean that a larger movement of the stick around the center will translate into a smaller movement of the quad, and it will give you more of a fine control over the quad when flying smooth lines. If, however, the quad feels sluggish and you feel like you have to just move the stick too much to get the quad to do anything, then increase the center stick sensitivity. Now, it's really important that you've tuned your PIDs before you do this, because if you have undertuned PIDs, the quad can also feel sluggish. And actually, this is something that a lot of people say to me when they've tuned their PIDs following my tuning process, is I had to go and redo my rates because the quad felt so twitchy after I had tuned my PIDs that I had to go back and change my rates to give me a little bit more center stick sensitivity to help the quad feel less twitchy. And that's actually a good thing, because what that's saying is that they previously had a really undertuned quad and now they have a quad that's tuned correctly. Too much sensitivity will make the quad feel twitchy. When we use actual rates, the Expo value affects the extent of the linear region near center stick. More Expo gives us more linearity around the center stick position at the expense of less linearity around the edges. And if we look at this graph, you can see what I mean. I've increased the Expo on roll, and roll is remaining more straight, more linear, further out towards the edge of the stick position, whereas the other axes are more smoothly curved. Similar to throttle, Expo is going to be very subjective, and it's going to be very dependent on the feel that you like. So if you're a pilot that likes flying really smooth lines and you want that very linear feel near the center stick, and then maybe occasionally you do snap rolls or snap flips, then you probably would want more Expo. If you're a pilot who tends to do moves over the full range of your sticks, then maybe you'd want less Expo so that you have more resolution out towards the edges. It really depends how you like to fly, but I think that most pilots can find the amount of Expo that they want just by trial and improvement once they know what the Expo does. And you can just change the Expo here. Again, I would suggest, change all the axes the same. That's always been my approach. So finally, we come to my recommendation for your rates. Please make sure that you always use a throttle limit if you find you don't use the full throttle range very much. And definitely use the throttle Expo, because that will make a big difference to how your quad feels, in my opinion. And I think most of us should be using a lot more throttle Expo than we are. Start with the default actual rates and work your way down for racing. start with the default actual rates and work your way up for freestyle. Or you can just do what I do and stick with the default rates. But you should definitely be using a throttle expo and throttle limit if you're not already. I hope that you found this video interesting and that you now feel like you have everything that you need to get your quad feeling just right on the sticks. If you like the work that I do and would like to support me, you can support me on Patreon. That will also give you access to a Discord server that I've just set up where you can discuss these and other FPV topics with like-minded pilots in a guaranteed drama and hype-free environment. So if that sounds intriguing to you, I'll put a link down in the video description. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. And until next time, I wish you all very, very happy flying.